Welcome to Risk Roundup. Today, we the humans are no longer confined to what nature must offer. The advances in science and technology has given us the capability to create things, while what nature has given is still the foundation to our natural biological ecosystem. We the humans are now able to build on this foundation and create a man-made synthetic bioecosystem of our desire and definition. We have reached a point where tools and technology to define and design entire human and non-human genomes have caught up to our ability to construct them. In the coming years, we will be able to design and construct any cell, organism, or any biological species we want with a growing selection of genome from human, non-human, or any other living species. The time is almost here where the ability to create or manipulate life seems restricted only by the imagination, as we will now be able to build any cell, organism, or biological species up from scratch. It is said that there is no such thing as an artificial gene, and what matters to a gene is sequence and not how one makes that sequence. It is this ability to synthesize DNA sequence from living and non-living species that has completely transformed much of everything. As a result, the industrial age is slowly but steadily drawing to a close to to be gradually replaced by an era of biological engineering. Nations are going to translation from an economy. They are going to transition from an economy that relied on machines to the one that relies on biology. It is therefore important to understand and evaluate the changing nature of economy, its impact on respective nations, its government, industries, organizations, academia, and individuals. To discuss this further, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Nathan Hillson to Risk Roundup. Dr. Nathan is the Director of Synthetic Biology Informatics at Joint BioEnergy Institute and is based in California. He's also the founder and chief scientific officer of Teslagen Biotechnology. Welcome, Dr. Nathan. We're delighted to have you on Risk Roundup.
Thank you. I'm very happy that I can join you today.
Wonderful, Nathan. So it seems the field of synthetic biology holds an inspiring vision for the future. What is it about synthetic biology that is exciting everyone?
Well, synthetic biology is actually a fairly broad endeavor. Largely speaking, a lot of people might say that it's just trying to apply the engineering principles to biology. So thinking about biology instead of just the basic science that people have been doing for a long time, trying to apply engineering principles around modularity, reproducibility, reliability, predictability, all of these types of engineering approaches and applying those towards biology. And there's lots and lots of different application spaces for synthetic biology. So many people might be familiar with things like some of the biomedical or therapeutic types of applications of synthetic biology. There's applications of synthetic biology just to enable us to understand the basic science better. There's also lots of things that you can do with synthetic biology in terms of using biology to make things that are of use to people. So things like materials or chemicals or fuels, things that might ordinarily be manufactured from petrochemicals.
Yes, that is a wonderful explanation, Nathan. Now, synthetic biology, so basically it seems to be about writing and programming new DNA with the goal of creating genetic machines from scratch, based on my understanding, and whether it be a new cell, organism, or species, by combining elements of engineering, chemistry, computer science, and molecular biology. Now, when we talk about the production of a new human-designed biological systems for the benefit of human society, what is the potential the advances in engineering, chemistry, computer science, and molecular biology has brought us?
Well, I think there's several different ways to think about it. And as we were kind of getting back to the synthetic biology might be the application of engineering principles to biology. Once you actually kind of have a robust engineering cycle where you can actually be a little bit more predictive in what you're doing towards what your eventual goal is, I think the rate of progress that people will be seeing towards any number of applications will be greatly accelerated. So that's just some things to keep in mind. Now, there might be many, many different types of application spaces. So if you're talking about trying to think about maybe human health versus trying to work with ecosystems versus trying to be applying these techniques in other areas. Generally, the overall kind of idea is that our rate of progress will be much more quick now that we're applying kind of more rigorous engineering principles as opposed to just kind of try and error types of approaches that maybe people have been doing in the past.
Yes, yes, that is a good explanation. Now, as we have learned more about how to read and manipulate genetic code, we have begun to take genetic information associated with useful features from one organism and add it to another one. Now, since we can create new cell or new organisms, plants, and hopefully animals and perhaps humans in the coming years, are we not redefining the very meaning of evolution?
So I guess there's several aspects to that, and the first thing is I think previously in the conversation you mentioned this idea maybe of engineering organisms from scratch, and there might be some people in the field that are kind of interested in doing those types of things, maybe minimal organisms, or actually having the ability at some point in time to be able to do things from scratch. I would say probably the on the ground reality right now is more about making slight modifications to existing systems rather than complete redesign of an organism. It's also really, really important that scientists and engineers are thinking more broadly about the aspects and implications of the research, such as the ethics and morals and social justice and environmental consequences. There's lots and lots of implications of all of these things, and it's very careful for people to be thinking ahead of time, if I am going to be accomplishing this goal, what are going to be the impacts just above and beyond just what my scientific publication would be, or maybe above and beyond what my commercial product is going to be. Because a lot of these technologies are going to have far-reaching applications, and we all live together on one planet, and as a big population, we all have some deliberative democracy types of ideas around, we should all have some consent and some buy-in to what people are actually doing.
Yeah.
So it's important to communicate what we're doing and to think more broadly about the work than just what we're doing at the bench.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, I agree with you that at this point, we are not creating, any species or any organism from scratch. But at the same time, when you have the potential, human mind is very curious. When we have the potential, it's just a matter of time before someone tries to do that. And when we try to do that, there are a lot of implications, as you suggested, that we have to be very careful about, even though, it's a democratic society and there are no regulations that prevents anyone from, creating such organism or any living thing anywhere in the world. We have to be very careful where we are going. So that brings, the point that what is the ultimate goal of synthetic biology? Where is the scientific community going with this?
Yeah, well, I guess the first thing that I would say is there are lots of regulations already in place, many of them going back decades, and many of them kind of do cover the scope of where we're going. So I wouldn't say there's no regulations, and people have best practices, and there are lots of standard biosafety practices, biomedical practices. So it's not that there are no regulations. I think that maybe something that people have been thinking about is the pace of technology development outpacing the regulatory frameworks. So I know that at least in the United States, the National Academies has been putting a lot of attention in all these new emerging technologies and trying to work together with some of our regulatory agencies to make sure they kind of keep up the pace. So that's maybe just one little thing to point out, is that there are existing regulations, and there might be others besides myself who might be more eloquent and able to speak to the regulatory aspects of these things. So that's one particular area, and there's many other kind of aspects where we could potentially talk about, especially if you're interested in risk, some of the risk associated with some of these activities. There's lots of people that have been talking about one technology in particular, gene drives, which might be able to impact in a very significant way in a very quick time frame some ecological systems. So you kind of mentioned maybe these things are happening a lot faster than they had in the past. They might have very far-reaching implications. And how do we think about these types of things? So there's been lots of discussions around technologies like gene drives. If you have engineered organisms and somehow a kind of a catastrophic event happens and they get exposed into the environment, are those organisms going to be contained? Are they going to be impacting the ecosystems? What's going to be happening? those are entirely also really, really big topics. And I think a lot of people have been thinking very carefully about those. And that especially is going to be important for some of these applications where maybe you're trying to go into the environment and do remediation. So maybe there's a heavy metal spill, or maybe kind of legacy type of work from back in the early days of the nuclear programs, and you're trying to do enrichment of all these heavy metals. Or maybe even now in some countries where they're doing lots of mining for things like copper or other precious metals, there might be some really interesting applications where you could deploy into the environment engineered organisms that can really help you accomplish your task, whether it's trying to remediate some type of a toxic spill, or actually trying to harness maybe very dilute but very precious metals from the environment. And I think especially for some of those environmental applications, it's going to be very, very important to understand how your engineered organism is going to be behaving in the context of the overall ecosystem. Now, most of the applications that people have been talking about are probably going to be more contained types of applications. So maybe in the biomanufacturing space, you're talking about kind of keeping them contained within fermentation reactors, or maybe in some kind of biomedical, therapeutic diagnostic applications contained within devices. And they're really not intended to be disseminated into the environment. So you have some best practices and regulations around how you dispose of these devices, or what do you do after you have a batch in your fermentation tank. So do you autoclave them? Do you bleach these organisms? How do you basically properly dispose of them so that they don't actually make it downstream into the environment? And other folks have even been trying to put in some engineering controls inside of the organisms themselves, so that, for example, maybe the organism really relies upon a combination of very specific molecules that are just not available in the environment. They might be 10 special ingredients that are completely man-made, that there's basically no natural source of. So there's a variety of approaches that people have been trying to look into in terms of containment, but these are all very, very important and interesting questions. And maybe in follow-up kind of discussions like these, you can have some conversations with people that are very informed in that space as well.
Absolutely. That is the goal, that, we won't be able to cover each and every topic that we want to cover in this session. So we are going to talk, heavily on regulation and other topics in the upcoming sessions. But today we'll just, briefly have an overview about all these topics that does matter, because a biological part can be anything from a DNA sequence to a promoter. And the problem is that many parts have not been characterized well, and they haven't always been tested to show what they do. And even when they have, the performance can change with different cell types or different kind of laboratory conditions. And when you release them in the environment, there are more variables to interact, and it creates more complex situations. So this is a cause of concern. So how will we control unexpected complexities if we just talk about this particular risk, that what we come up with during a laboratory experiment is not necessarily what will happen out in the environmental ecosystem. So how are we planning to control such unexpected complexities? Because at this point, the MIT's, has almost, if I'm correct, 5,000 parts available. It could be more to order, and none of them, they don't guarantee any of their quality or how their performance would be. So there are a lot of, complexities, and there are a lot of complex challenges that brings many kinds of risk because of, the stage where we are in the development of this ecosystem. So how are the scientists thinking of controlling those kind of unexpected complexities?
Yeah, so you had a lot of interesting things in that last statement, and maybe I'll just kind of pick on two of them. And the first one, I think I would completely agree, and many people would agree, that right now a lot of biology is very context dependent. So maybe in a cell phone, you can isolate a given transistor for every single other transistor in the chip. So all you have to do is really understand how that one transistor works in isolation, and it's kind of basically it's compartmentalized, and it's basically kind of decoupled from the rest of the system. So as long as you understand it kind of in isolation, it's so modular that you can basically just put a whole bunch of parts together, and they're all going to kind of behave as they kind of did by themselves. In biology in general, at least right now, a lot of our understanding isn't to that level of engineering practice. So like you're saying, if you have one particular component in one organism and now you want to study it in a slightly different organism, does it perform in exactly the same way? And in general, at least for us right now, the answer is no. It generally will have a slightly different performance characteristic. So now the question that you're asking is, okay, so now if biology is extremely context dependent, and maybe also coupled that with maybe our predictive tools aren't fantastic, so we can't maybe a priori predict ahead of time what the performance is going to be as you go from one organism to another, then how do you kind of put sufficient controls in place? And just within any engineering type of a discipline, there's many different types of controls that you can put into place. So maybe certain types of things you can establish kind of normal operating conditions, normal operating paradigms that you say, as long as you're considering how this is going to operate within this range of organisms, within these particular environmental conditions, this is how we expect this particular component to operate. Now, that isn't going to get you all the way there, because maybe you're, I don't know, operating outside of those conditions, things that you couldn't have predicted ahead of time. So then basically there's other types of engineering controls, and you can kind of think of physical controls. So we kind of talked about some of the containment types of issues. So there can be physical containment. So if you're mostly interested in a microbial type of a system, how do you kind of keep it physically isolated from the outside world? How do you make sure that you properly kind of either autoclave or sterilize a culture before you send it downstream to a wastewater treatment plant? And then you can kind of think about these catastrophic failure scenarios where maybe after you run a fermentation tank, for some reason the autoclave method fails, or maybe you have a bad batch of bleach that doesn't actually kill all the organisms, and somehow some of them make it downstream to a wastewater treatment plant. And that's when you kind of need to start thinking about these other types of controls. Are there ways of doing monitoring? So for example, are we able to monitor when maybe something like this happens? Can you detect in a downstream wastewater treatment plant when maybe some of these organisms have actually made it downstream? We already kind of mentioned a little bit earlier about some of these more internal genetic types of controls, that if an organism is outside of a very controlled type of an operating condition, then maybe it's no longer able to propagate itself. And you also mentioned things like, okay, well, we understand very well that it's pretty much one common genetic code, and sometimes you can take genes from one organism and put them into another organism, and they'll still be operational to a certain extent. So if you're concerned not only about your engineered organism surviving in the environment, but it potentially transferring its genes to other organisms in the environment, or potentially receiving genes from organisms in the environment, how might you think about trying to mitigate some of those possibilities? So some people have also been thinking about trying to do highly recoded types of kind of genetic structures. So instead of having kind of the common translation table from DNA to proteins, what would happen if you had a slightly different encoding table? So if you have it from your organism of interest, a particular set of DNA is going to result in one amino acid, but everywhere else in the world, in the environment, all the other organisms are going to be translating it to a slightly different message. So then you have kind of concepts around, it's not really cryptography, but it's kind of like that maybe in your organism of interest, you have a particular way of translating, and then all the other organisms in the world are speaking a different language, and they won't be able to understand it. So there can be some mechanisms in place where you can try to prevent these downstream scenarios from happening. So there's lots of really brilliant people working on a lot of these different types of solutions. And I think the idea is, with all of these risks and all of these analysis, it should basically just layer upon layer of engineering controls. So there's lots of uncertainties, and we don't necessarily know everything. But if you have enough of these controls in place, the expected probability that something is going to happen is basically attenuated to the point where the benefit greatly exceeds the risk. Another thing that's going to be really important that I think that people haven't had the opportunity to do as much as they might want to do is actually do some field testing. So for example, people might be developing all of these containment systems in the context of just a laboratory, at a laboratory bench. But until you actually get into the field and you deploy these strategies, do they actually work as advertised? So it becomes much more complicated and much more expensive to, for example, could you do a field trial where you're actually investigating what would happen if my microbe were in the soil with other organisms? What's going to happen? Or what happens if my organism actually makes it downstream into a wastewater treatment plant? What actually is going to happen there? And I think that it would be fantastic if the US government and others around the world actually invested in some of these really important studies to actually get the real data, what would actually happen, as opposed to people making these hand-wavy arguments that, we did such and such and the chances are so low, it's never going to happen. And we can actually start to assess some of those things. But I don't think that's happened as much as we might want to like to already. But another thing just to add in passing is that it's one thing to think about, okay, there might be some of these outcomes that we don't want either as a country or as a global population, or maybe certain populations might be benefited more than others. And it's one thing to say that, okay, we don't want to tolerate these downstream, outcomes. We should just basically prevent in a precautionary type of an approach. We should basically prevent these things from happening in the first place. But you always have to weigh that against kind of the opportunity cost of the benefits that you would lose. So if you just go ahead and say that we're going to completely avoid doing any of these types of technology developments or product developments, then you have to think about all of the people that might be adversely impacted. So whether that's energy security, or whether that's health security or food security, or just being able to have higher quality of life, higher environmental conditions. There might be lots of benefits that we might be foregoing if we just decide that we don't want to go down this path. So it's always a cost benefit, a risk analysis. So what are the bad outcomes and how can we mitigate those as best as possible while still achieving all of these good upsides?
Of course, and we should never try to stop progress in science and development, because that is the economic engine, and we always want new technologies, new innovations, new way of doing things. But here my concern is that anybody could with the current framework that we have, that anyone can purchase the gene that they want, or anyone can hire computer scientists to add to the synthetic gene, and anybody can, sitting in any part of the world, they can create any organism to create a pathological organism to wipe out the human species. That is a possibility. Now again, we don't need to be afraid of that. We just need to put together proper effective controls so that we can control and we can track who is building, because right now there is no requirement that only if you are affiliated with an institution you are entitled to purchase this kind of genes or whatever other material you require to create any synthetic organism or living thing. There is no requirement like that. So anybody could purchase whatever they want, and that is the big fear here. We don't have effective regulation, and even if we have regulations, this is something we will not be able to control. Because how would anyone know if somebody sitting in their basement or garage or their lab in a warehouse, they create some kind of organism? There is no way to do that unless we use effective technology to track and to monitor. We do have amazing advances in technology, but again, that is not the goal of the discussion here. We will address that what technology to use to effectively track who is developing what, and what kind of advances are happening in what part of the world, and who is creating what organism, who is buying what kind of genes, and what could be their goal for that. So that is a topic of whole other discussion. Let's talk a little bit about the bioeconomy, the economic activity that is fueled by research and innovation in the biological sciences. It's very promising, and it's understandably very promising because it's based on the synthetic biology that has a huge potential. What potential do you see the bioeconomy bringing to all nations, not just United Nations, but United States, not just United States, but all nations?
So I would really like to talk about the bioeconomy, but I think I should at least touch upon some of the remarks you made about maybe some of the biological weapons, or how easy it is to actually make these organisms or obtain genes and things like that. And my first remark would be that maybe the community is kind of overhyped our capacity and our ability to actually engineer living systems. It's really not as easy as some might be claiming it to be. Even in a very well, resourced institution like the Joint BioEnergy Institute, oftentimes the biological systems don't behave as we would like them to, and we're highly trained, highly resourced. We have brilliant minds here, and oftentimes what we want to have happen basically isn't the way that biology works out. I think oftentimes when you get computer scientists, you mentioned maybe a computer scientist could just come in and design a new gene. I think oftentimes computer scientists are extremely excited about synthetic biology, but when they actually come and get a reality check that it's not nearly as easy as they thought, computer programming is trivial in certain ways because it's people that make all of the rules. If a program doesn't compile or it generates the incorrect output, you can always go back into the program and figure out exactly why it's not working. It's not that easy with biology. You can't just debug like a microbial system as easy as you can some type of a piece of software. So it's not that easy to just go in and do these things. I don't want anybody in the public to be misled to thinking that this is actually easy. This is actually still extremely hard, and there aren't too many places around the world that can do this effectively. The other thing, just to remark, is that there is an international gene synthesis consortium, and they basically have a very well regimented set of practices. Along together with the United States Department of Health and Human Services, they have guidelines for synthetic providers of DNA. So all of these synthetic commercial companies are screening not only the sequences. So for example, they won't sell you sequences that are highly homologous to a virus or to select agents or other things of concern. But not only do they screen the sequences, they also screen the people. And I would disagree with you that anybody can get access to these gene sequences. Synthetic vendors generally nowadays are going to be very careful about who they send these genes to. So as you're saying, there might be some companies that might be following slightly different sets of practices, and they might be more willing to send it to some people than others. But there are, the vast majority of companies that are in this space are following these guidelines, and they're actually doing a good job about it. And I think the federal governments are very, interested in this. And there's also export control laws, which also kind of are very sensitive to the types of instruments and equipment that can then be fabricating these types of things. So I think there's lots of people that are paying a lot of attention to it. So not only is it not that easy to do, but there are quite a few controls in place to make sure that people aren't doing the wrong kind of thing. Now you can have complete, long discussions with other people around bioweapons and dual use research of concerns. But I would really like to get back to what you were asking about, was the bioeconomy. So I think that's extremely important. And just so that people kind of are familiar with what the bioeconomy is basically just the portions of our economy that are really enabled through biology. Now that includes agriculture. So all of the systems that generate our food. It's going to be lots of the biomedical types of space. So all of our therapeutics and our diagnostics, things that rely on biological types of systems. It's also kind of just regular industry. So a lot of our chemicals and materials are sourced from biological means, as opposed to maybe just purely from petrochemicals or other types of processes. And it turns out that the bioeconomy around the world, not just in the U.S., is growing at a very fast rate. And it's also very important for individual countries to strategically think about their competitiveness in terms of their bioeconomy. So, for example, in the United States, the Department of Energy has conducted a study several times. It has updates recently that essentially in the United States they have about 1 billion metric tons of biomass that's available per year that could get used for useful purposes. So that doesn't include things like all of our food crops or all of the forestry products that we use for paper or for timber. It doesn't include basically things that we'd normally be using things for. But you think that the United States has 1 billion metric tons of biomass that it could be doing something productively with every year. Maybe the first thing that you might think of that you could just do is burn it for its energy content. So maybe you could just burn all of this biomass and drive turbines to generate electricity. That's probably the it's useful, but it's probably problematic, and that you might be able to make a lot of more value out of that rather than just burning it to make other useful products. And also, if you just burn the biomass directly, well, then maybe you're just releasing all that carbon into the atmosphere, and that might not be something that you might want to be doing. But I think a lot of the interest in the bioeconomy right now is how do we take all of this biomass, and it's not just in the US, there's many places around the world that have lots of available biomass. And how do you really make very useful things out of this biomass? So how do you kind of convert your existing biomass, whether it's agricultural residues, or whether it's municipal waste, or whether it's basically just maybe in places where you can kind of grow dedicated crops for various types of grasses or trees. How do you kind of convert that all into useful products that you can sell? So some of those products might include things like fuels. So can you kind of convert some grasses that you can kind of grow maybe in some prairies into things like gasoline or diesel or jet fuel replacements? Can you make them into these commodity types of chemicals? So instead of deriving all of our chemicals from petroleum, could we also think about sourcing them from biological types of feedstocks, from plants, so like trees or grasses or other types of things? In addition to chemicals, I mean, you could think about things like therapeutics. You could think about the components of materials. And then I think there's a lot of people that have been thinking about how can they do direct drop-in replacements. So maybe if the chemistry or synthetic chemistry industries right now oftentimes will use certain building block chemicals. So a lot of people are trying to figure out, okay, how can I get a biological route to produce that same type of a chemical building block? Because maybe if I can beat the price point of a petroleum process, then maybe I'm going to make a lot of money, because maybe it only costs me 50 cents to produce something from a plant, where if I have to get it from oil, it's going to cost me $1. Or maybe it's not just about the actual price. Maybe it might be that you have lower operating expenses. So maybe the petrochemical process requires high temperatures or extreme solvent conditions, and maybe the biological process is a little bit more moderate. Maybe the waste streams are easier to process, and et cetera. So there might be lots and lots of reasons for why you'd want to go after more of a biological-based approach than a chemical-based approach. And sometimes it's also really interesting to think about hybrids between the two. So maybe you're using biology for what biology is really good at, and more traditional chemistry for what chemistry is very good at. But beyond just kind of going after things like fuels or chemical building blocks, there's a lot of interest also in trying to use biology to make things that's very difficult to access through traditional synthetic chemistry. So representatives of that might be things that are highly in certain chemicals, you have kind of these regions of the molecules where they're basically like one hand or the other, so like right-handed or left-handed. So kind of like the stereochemistry. So it turns out that in a lot of synthetic chemistry, oftentimes it's really difficult to site selectively control maybe the stereochemistry of a particular part of a molecule. But maybe biology is fantastic at that. So if you can come up with a biological route, you might be able to make entirely new chemicals or entirely new materials that chemistry might have a really hard time accessing. So you can imagine not just replacing what we already have because maybe it's cheaper or faster or for whatever reason, but you can imagine entirely new types of chemicals and molecules that might have entirely different performance characteristics than what you could achieve through traditional petrochemical, synthetic chemistry types of things. So I think there's lots of really, really exciting work that's happening across all of these spectra. So it's clear that the bioeconomy is growing very quickly. It's very important to the U.S. It's several percentages of our gross domestic product. It's not a small industry. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars a year easily. And then when you're talking about a little bit about risk assessment, now you kind of have to think about from maybe a domestic policy type of view. What are your risks to these economies? So if you're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars a year, this could potentially be a risk that you don't want, for example, some other nation state or maybe a non-state actor to jeopardize your economy. So for example, we wouldn't want to have another state be able to shut down our food production. that would be a very, very bad thing for us. So, what are the actual risks? And so I think food production is something that a lot of people understand. But increasingly, as we use biology to make more and more of our chemicals or our plastics, our materials, our fuels, our therapeutics, our diagnostics, it's really important to realize that the bioeconomy has its own sets of sensitivities and risks. And since it's such a new type of a technology and a new industry, I think that it's just starting to kind of realize that it needs to pay attention to certain types of aspects. So for example, maybe in the information technology domain, there's been lots and lots of talk recently about cybersecurity. So how do you kind of keep all of your information protected and private and not susceptible to outside actors kind of getting in? But increasingly, as the bioeconomy is also powered a lot by information, I think people in the bioeconomy are also increasingly going to be trying to look at their own cybersecurity in terms of their actual applications and their pipelines and their protocols. And certain things to think about in terms of the bioeconomy is that it's not that all of these activities are happening in one central facility. So it's not like you can have one central facility and just have firewalls and make sure that you can completely control everything within that facility. A lot of the bioeconomy is almost distributed by nature. So a lot of the feedstocks, they're basically, their price points are so low that it's almost cost prohibitive to ship the feedstocks too far. So for example, if you're growing in maybe in the middle of the United States, if you're growing a lot of straw or certain other types of crops, you almost need to upgrade those materials to a more valuable product within maybe like say a 60 or 100-mile radius, because to actually load all of that straw and ship it on a shipping container or like a train car, it's going to cost you more to ship that particular feedstock than maybe you can just buy it somewhere else. So it's going to be very important to have all of these biorefineries very distributed across the world and across the country. So you're going to be kind of, by default, all these activities are going to be distributed. And it's also the case that a lot of the infrastructure around the bioeconomy is also distributed. So there might be some really fantastic analytical facilities in one part of the country and maybe scale-up facilities in another part of the country. And it's not just like one small factory in the Midwest that's doing everything. It's lots of activities across lots of different people. And there's physical objects that are getting shipped around, but there's also all the information. Really important information. As we're kind of talking about at the very beginning of the conversation, synthetic biology is becoming much more of like an engineering discipline. And a lot of the engineering disciplines are really around this engineering cycle, where a big part of why you can do things fast now is that you can simulate or you can do really good predictions. And a lot of that simulation or prediction capacity is basically built on top of lots and lots of data. So basically, you've studied in the past how all these systems behave, and based on how these systems have behaved or acted in the past, you can kind of predict or simulate how maybe a modification to that system might behave. Now, if you're generating all of these designs based on all of this data, and you're relying upon all of these simulation tools or these predictive tools, and this is basically the backbone of your bioeconomy, now you can imagine that if you don't really protect all of that data, if you don't protect all of these simulation types of tools or these predictive types of tools, or you don't protect your samples, so maybe if somebody tampers with your samples between point A and point B, and now you're actually trying to scale up an organism that's completely different than the organism you intended, then there can be lots of points in the supply chain or the information chain that are susceptible to attacks. Yeah. So I think now, at least in the United States, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, is looking very carefully at how they basically can secure the bioeconomy. So it's not just about bioweapons, it's actually trying to make sure that we don't have bad state actors or non-state actors start to disrupt our bioeconomy. And I think that's where a lot of kind of the interest is right now, is not just around bioweapons, but really kind of protecting these billions, hundreds and billions of dollars of economic activity.
Yes,
it's very important.
Yes. Now go finish that, please.
Oh yeah, that was pretty much the end of the thought there. Yeah.
Right, right. No, you're absolutely right that there is a very heavy focus on protecting what we have, the intellectual property, and how to do all the innovation data and everything surrounding it. We have to protect that, and because we are working towards solving critical challenges in manufacturing, energy, healthcare, agriculture, and environment. And there is very severe competition, going on between nations. So, talking about that competitiveness, which nation do you think is taking a lead in bioeconomy at this point? Because, from my understanding, Europe is very aggressively working towards it, UK, Brazil, and Asia, and United States, of course. So, who is leading the effort at this point?
Yeah, and I would also mention India. I don't know if I heard you mention India also, but they're also very
Right.
interested in working in this space as well. But yeah, you already kind of mentioned all the big players. I mean, probably maybe the major incumbent is the U.S. So as you travel around the world, I think a lot of people look to what's happening in the U.S. in terms of biotechnology and the bioeconomy and synthetic biology. But Western Europe has been doing fantastic work. I think in a lot of ways, the efforts ongoing in Western Europe are extremely compatible and complementary to what's going on in the United States, especially kind of when you look at kind of a physiological understanding of organisms. I think some of the countries in Western Europe are far surpassing what's happening in the States. And then maybe in the US, maybe around some of the molecular biology or some of those other types of technologies, maybe we're a little bit more advanced here. If you look at places like China, China is investing tons and tons of resources in trying to come up to speed with places like Western Europe or the US. So they have lots and lots of people. They have lots of resources. They have the will. They have the motivation. And
Yes.
they have their own sets of challenges that they need to address.
Yes.
And you mentioned places like maybe Brazil.
Yes.
And Brazil is very interesting because they it's kind of like the U.S. in that they have lots and lots of resources. I mean, they have all the sugar cane, and they have lots and lots of space to kind of grow biomass. So how can they valorize that? How can they benefit the quality of life for Brazilian citizens based on all these resources that they have? And I think a lot of companies, both from the U.S. and from Europe and elsewhere, have been going to Brazil because it's probably the most affordable supply of sugar in the world. So if that's kind of like your feedstock cost is the sugars, then you kind of want to have a footprint in Brazil because that's basically where it would be most effective to do those types of activities. So Brazil is for sure interested. And I think also India is extremely interested, and they have lots of biotechnology. I mean, they've been doing lots and lots of fermentation and lots and types of agricultural types of work. And maybe to a certain extent, they in certain areas, maybe molecular biology and so on, they might not yet be as advanced as places like the U.S. But I think they're keeping their eyes open, and they're starting to invest in the space as well too.
I see.
And there are other places that maybe haven't been paying as much attention to kind of these new biotech areas. So maybe in the African continent, maybe in South Africa, or maybe in some other places within Africa, people are paying attention to it, but maybe not as much there. Or maybe if you look in Eastern Europe and some other countries, maybe it's a little bit less represented. But I mean, I think there's lots of places across the world. Singapore, for example, is investing a lot of money. The United Kingdom has been investing a lot of money, and I think a lot of the countries are really thinking about competitiveness.
Yes.
They really they understand that this is kind of the economy of the future. This is where all these things are going, and they want to make sure they basically have a seat at the table, and that they can have intellectual as well as maybe physical manufacturing operations at home, and they don't necessarily want to be entirely dependent on other countries providing either the domain expertise or the actual products. So I think this probably is like a national economy, security type of an issue, and part of that is just normal scientific competitiveness and academia and things like that. But I think it's also really about industry and potentially even in the defense sector. I think there's lots of people that are looking into these things, whether it's for countermeasures. For example, can we produce a lot of potential antibiotics that might be effective against new infectious diseases? Can we make new materials maybe to better protect our troops, or to make lighter weight aircraft or more resilient armor? I think there's lots and lots of application spaces, and I think a lot of countries are very, very interested in that.
Very true. Now, on the basis of advances in bioeconomy that you see, what are the emerging trends?
Yeah, so I think there's several things. I mean, I think that one thing is that a lot of people are starting to look more and more into biology for fabricating things. So lots of fermentative types of products. So instead of sourcing everything from petroleum, sourcing things from more biological types of routes. And I think really one of the things that's also going to happen a lot too is this concept of distributed biomanufacturing. So it's probably not going to be kind of, if you look in the petrochemical industry, my understanding is that there's kind of these scaling laws, which is why you have these enormous refining plants, maybe in Texas and Louisiana, and basically to get to kind of like the real efficiencies, you have to get to very, very big scales. Whereas with biology, you might have kind of slightly different challenges where maybe just the logistics of the feedstocks force you to be kind of in a distributed operation. And you can imagine, things where you might have manufacturing operations many places across a country, maybe more in a military or defense type of a setting. You can imagine that you could actually be, instead of having to maintain these extended supply lines, you might be able to manufacture what you need at that particular site where you are. Or people have been talking about, with NASA and space travel going to Mars. I think there's lots of also trends in trying to figure out, if we know that we have to have a 20-year mission to go somewhere, we basically can't supply it from Earth. We're gonna have to have it basically produced on the spacecraft itself. So I think there's a lot of trends in trying to figure out how can I fabricate what I'm interested in biologically, because that might be economically advantageous. Maybe I can get to entirely new materials that I couldn't get to through traditional approaches. More of a distributed manufacturing type of an operation rather than completely a centralized way. And things that we might not have thought about before, but things like space travel and things like that. So I think there's lots of extremely interesting types of things that are happening.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, the current backbone of our energy and chemical industries is carbon-based fossil fuels. Today, even though we have some advances in these biosciences, we still rely primarily on oil, coal, and natural gas to run our cars or heat our homes and provide the raw material to many different products, from drugs to plastics to name it, fertilizer. So how have we started using rather microorganisms to produce biofuels?
Yeah, so I think there's several things along those lines, and maybe one thing, just as you were mentioning, right now we rely a lot upon petroleum or natural gas, coal, and there are some really interesting companies and academic efforts that are actually trying to think about how can we use natural gas as a feedstock. Natural gas is extremely attractive because it's a very, very reduced compound, as opposed to maybe like sugar, which is very, very oxidized. So if you're trying to make very reduced types of products, then natural gas might be a fantastic feedstock as opposed to something like a sugar. So maybe if you're trying to make therapeutics with lots of kind of oxidized compounds, sugar is fantastic, but maybe if you want to make fuels or other types of fully reduced compounds, then maybe natural gas is a way to go. So you could even think about using natural gas as a feedstock for some of these biological systems for making things like you're mentioning, like fertilizers, or maybe animal types of feed, or just making other types of interesting chemicals and materials and things like that. But in terms of biology, actually producing the fuels maybe more from biomass as opposed to natural gas or coal or petroleum, there's been a lot of work by ourselves here at the Joint BioEnergy Institute and lots of other fantastic institutions around the country and around the world, where the concept is that now that we're getting better at engineering, for example, plants, we might be able to have plants have more ideal compositions for converting them into downstream fuels. So oftentimes, what we do is we take the plants and we kind of break them into their constitutive components, such as maybe cellulose, which contains a lot of the 6-carbon sugars. And microbes love to eat 6-carbon sugars. That's like their favorite. So if you can maybe have a tree or a grass that's almost exclusively 6-carbon sugars, that's going to be fantastic for your downstream microbes because that's what they really, really like. So can we engineer plants to have more, 6-carbon sugar rather than other types of things? Or maybe going forward, there's going to be lots of really interesting work in how can we use the lignin component of the plant to make interesting chemicals and materials. So lignin is basically kind of an aromatic compound that's highly cross-linked. And for the most part, people have been just burning it for its energy content. Or some people have been trying to figure out how we can use it to make things like carbon fiber, other types of applications. But if we might be able to engineer our microbes to use lignin or a slightly modified structure of lignin to make interesting chemicals and materials, that might be extremely exciting as well.
Yes.
In the fuels space in particular, what we've been doing a lot is engineering the microbes basically by introducing these exogenous metabolic pathways to produce things they wouldn't normally produce. So I think in the very opening remarks, you said something that we're no longer stuck with what nature gives us. We can actually engineer it to make what we want. So right now, the first generation of these fuels, we would have included things like ethanol or traditional biodiesel, which is essentially just like a triacylglyceride or something like a vegetable oil, and then basically sterifying it into something like a first generation biodiesel. What we've been doing now is actually engineering the organisms themselves to not make ethanol, but more of a direct replacement for things like a gasoline or a diesel or a jet fuel. So maybe in the diesel space, you might have some terpenoid types of compounds. At JBay, we've been developing bisabolane, which is a 15-carbon kind of molecule that's basically be very good for blending into diesels or potentially even into jet fuels. Downstairs in our very building is Amyris, and they've been going after farnesene, which is a very related compound, and they've been producing it already in Brazil and using it in lots of the city buses in Sao Paulo. And then in terms of gasoline, people have been doing things here with higher order alcohols. So at JBay, we've been doing kind of like a 5-carbon alcohol, isopentanol, which is actually an excellent type of a gasoline replacement. Some of the exciting things about these fuels is that not only do they work with kind of our existing cars and trucks, so you don't need a flex fuel vehicle, you can just kind of do a direct drop-in replacement. But the really exciting thing is that these fuels that we might be able to make biologically are even better suited for the next generation of engines. So people have been looking at new engine types that are kind of hybrids, for example, between like a diesel engine and a gasoline engine. So it turns out that some of these fuels like isopentanol might outperform our existing kind of gasoline or diesel in those types of engines. So there's some efforts that are supported now by the Department of Energy in the US. It's called co-optima, and the idea is can you kind of co-optimize the fuels together with the engines themselves. So you try to evolve them both in parallel as opposed to just trying to keep the fuel constant and change the engine or change the engine or keep the engine constant and change the fuel. So they're trying to co-optimize them together. And part of that is that biology might give us access to these new fuel molecules that maybe petrochemistry is going to have a really hard time doing. So there's lots of very interesting things in the fuel space that's happening.
Yes, so it seems. So what is the status on biomass energy systems, or as you say, biorefineries?
Yeah, so I think there's lots of different efforts. There's folks that are using, because I was kind of referring to as plants, so trees and grasses. There's other people that are working on kind of algal types of systems as another kind of way of producing feedstock. So there's lots of efforts going into making better trees and grasses and algal systems. There's lots of work going into how do you kind of pre-treat these plants or algal systems into maybe precursors to chemicals of interest. So for example, can there be, and then this gets into the area more of kind of chemical engineering or even in some kind of enzymology. So we talked a little bit earlier about how logistics makes it very complicated to ship feedstocks from one place to another, where if you try to ship things more than about 60 miles, 100 miles, it's no longer cost effective. So what some people have been thinking about doing is, well, maybe you can have these little local refineries that might upgrade the biomass into these intermediates. So it might be a sugar that they're basically upgrading it to. It might be other types of chemical intermediates. So I think there's lots of interest going on right now about how do you kind of increase the energy density of some of these processes, or just upgrade the value, so that now you could effectively put them onto shipping containers or train cars, or even thinking about using pipelines. So there might be liquid types of things that you can be shipping around that are high value, just as petroleum is today. And then there's lots and lots of work around the microbial engineering, around how do you actually get a microbe at very efficient kind of metrics around like your yields or your titers or your productivities. How do you actually produce these new types of molecules in the context of the upstream feedstock and downstream processing and all these types of things? So there's lots of things happening in the space, and it's big teams of people, and it's distributed. It's not even in one country; it's across the world. But there's lots and lots of types of activities in this space. And one of the things just to be aware of is that a lot of this work is not only happening in government or in academia, but it's also in industry. And industry can't keep its technology and its intellectual property very close to the chest. So there might be really interesting things that companies are doing right now that they just haven't made public yet.
Yes, yes. So it seems now there are reports that powering our planet would require between 15 and 18 terawatts of energy. How much of that could we manufacture with the tools of synthetic biology that we have at present?
Yeah, so I am a little bit ignorant kind of in the global energy space. But what I can tell you is at least a little bit what I know about the US energy expenditures. So my understanding, and probably like a hand-waving loose approximation, would be something, and you can probably do all the fact-checking on this as well. But my understanding is that, let's say that we took the 1 billion tons of biomass that's available each year in the US, and we just burned it for its energy content. I think basically we would be providing about half of the energy needs of the US per year. So if you basically went purely to a biomass solution, you'd probably only get half of the way there. So it's going to have to be other technologies as well. It can't just be biomass. It also probably will have to be things like solar, wind, nuclear, and maybe as a stopgap, kind of bridging technology, things like natural gas. Maybe eventually at some point, people get to the point where they can actually do fusion reactors, not just fission reactors. But it's not purely going to be about biology. So I think maybe where biology is going to be the most useful is probably in producing liquid fuels. So you might be able to power light-duty vehicles, passenger cars with electricity, but you're probably going to have a big challenge in trying to power jets with electricity. They probably really need very, very high energy densities, and liquid fuels are perfect for that. So while biology probably can't provide all of the energy requirements for a country like the US, it might be able to supply all of the liquid transportation fuels that are required. So that you have to be kind of a little bit more strategic about where you're applying the biomass. And beyond just kind of fuels, which is an enormous market, there's also all the commodity chemicals. So commodity chemicals, in terms of a barrel of oil, I don't remember exactly what the numbers are, but say maybe around 10% of a barrel of oil go into chemicals. And the rest of it is largely into fuels. But also replacing that 10% of the barrel of oil for going into commodity chemicals and specialty chemicals and those types of things. The other thing that's been really interesting over the last decade or so is that people have been thinking about, okay, let's imagine a world where we have nuclear fusion reactors. So let's say we almost have endless electricity, no problem. But we don't have liquid fuels. So there have been programs supported by the Department of Energy and other agencies in the US where they've been trying to figure out clever ways of going from electricity into biologically produced molecules. And there's various ways that people have been thinking about that. There might actually be organisms themselves can actually just adhere to electronics, and they might be able to convert electrical currents into kind of chemical products. There might be other ways of doing it. For example, you could just do lots of hydrolysis. So you basically just use electricity to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. And there are certain organisms that can basically use hydrogen gas as basically their source of reducing equivalents. And maybe carbon dioxide is their source of carbon. So there's an organism, for example, Ralstonia eutropha, which can basically take hydrogen gas and carbon dioxide as basically its sole energy and carbon sources. So there have been people figuring out, okay, if we have lots of cheap electricity, how can we convert that into something that's more biologically made? So there's lots of efforts that are ongoing in that space as well. And I think the problem there is that you might face very stiff penalties when you're converting energy from electricity into the liquid fuel. So it's going to be very lossy, I would imagine. But because liquid fuels are so important, or because chemicals are so important above and beyond what electricity can do, then I think people are going to be willing to make some of those trade-offs.
Right. No, that would be great. We will have to make some trade-offs. We'll have to prioritize and evaluate the risk versus rewards. Now, over the years, we have seen the industrial mode of development, and it has worked for almost like 2 centuries now. But it seems that we are slowly coming off the industrial model of development that is coming to a close, and it will be replaced by an era of biological engineering, as we have been talking for last almost an hour. And we are going to transition from a world that relied on machines to the one that relies on biology, and that is going to be pretty amazing advances. But what is the time frame we are looking at for the bioeconomy to have a significant impact?
Yeah, so I think probably there still will be a lot of machines involved. A lot of them might not look like maybe traditional types of manufacturing equipment, although I still see a lot of that equipment still persisting for a long time. And maybe the machines are going to be more biological focused types of instruments, and even getting into very small microfluidic devices. But there still will be a tremendous amount of robots, I would say. Even if a lot of the manufacturing capacity moves over to more biological as opposed to some of these other mechanisms. So that's something just to kind of point out. And then the kind of getting back to your question, can you remind me, like, you kind of wanted to know like where all of these things are going with going away from the traditional industry into kind of more of like an era where it's biology that's producing these things. Like, what else is going to be kind of changing? Like, what else do we kind of anticipate?
Yes.
I really do kind of getting back on these earlier points around distributed manufacturing, where it's going to be kind of lots of places across the country or across the world that are going to be producing things. I don't think it's just going to be one single central facility that makes things for a lot of places. So I think that can actually be extremely good for people that don't necessarily live in big urban centers. Like if they do live in more rural parts of the country, that they're going to be extremely relevant going forward, because it might actually be the most cost-effective thing to do to manufacture right next to where your supply of your feedstock is.
Yes, and we want to get rid of the dependencies. We don't want one country or one industry developing everything. We want this to be, like you said, distributed everywhere. So right where you need it. And that.
And I think the second part of your question was kind of around the timelines, like how fast is this going to happen? There are some challenges. So in the bioeconomy in general, some of the things to think about is that there aren't necessarily established markets for some of these feedstocks. So there's very well-established markets for things like corn. Like it's basically as a commodity. You can go to the Chicago Board of Trade and buy futures or options for corn. But there probably isn't a market right now for switchgrass or for miscanthus. So I think some of these supply chains and markets really kind of need to become matured before farmers are going to start converting over their crops. Because they're extremely smart people, and they're not going to just suddenly making something for which they can't sell it. If a market doesn't exist, like, why am I going to, especially with some of these crops like miscanthus or switchgrass, which aren't annual crops, they're more perennials. So you make a long-term investment, or things like trees are the same way. You make long-term investment. So I think it's probably going to take some time before those markets really start to emerge and really make all of these things really, really possible on a big scale. Yeah. I would say on a shorter time scale, people are going to be looking much more into very, very high value products. So things like therapeutics or cosmetics or fragrances or flavor additives, things like that. Things where you don't necessarily need to make a ton of it, but you can get a very high price and you can kind of basically support all of your operations.
Yes.
And as things like maybe as food prices increase, or maybe as oil prices increase, then you can take those same technologies and cost effectively deploy them to make these commodity chemicals or these fuels, things like that. Now, in terms of other types of just general technology timelines, I think you're already starting to see people starting to think about clever ways of interfacing 3D printing with some of these synthetic biology approaches. So, oftentimes if you're thinking about more, tissues, like if you want to or to replace somebody's kidney, for example, are there ways that maybe we can actually grow a replacement kidney for somebody that's perfectly matched against the person that needs it, instead of having to get like a kidney transplant? And there's very interesting and exciting work that's ongoing in that field. Or maybe instead of trying to go through oftentimes early preclinical work for a drug, you might be using animal models to test. So maybe you look at mice, or you look at rabbits, or you might look at other types of animals to basically kind of test for things before you actually go test them in people. And there's also a lot of really interesting work that's happening around, well, maybe kind of like in a small form factor, maybe with microfluidics, can I actually have kind of like cell culture representing each of the different organisms in a person? And it's not just some generic person. You could almost imagine basically trying to match the exact organs that would be coming from a patient. So maybe a particular patient has their own custom microfluidic device that has basically little replicas of their tissues on the chip. So you can actually test for a specific patient, is this drug going to be efficacious? What is its toxicity profile? Are there going to be side effects? So there's all kinds of exciting things that people have been talking about. And they're starting to work on these things. And it's a really good question about, what is the timeline for this? Because you have to do the technology development, but then you also have to go through all the clinical trials, all the regulatory, types of approvals. So some of these things, are not going to be here next year, but they're probably not going to take 50 years to mature either. We'll have to wait and see. But it's probably in this intermediate, time frame where we're going to probably start to see very successful products in the short term, very high value, high profit margin types of products.
Yes.
And then maybe as markets shift for food prices and for oil prices, maybe kind of domestic security types of issues, maybe you start having more emphasis on these things. And that'll kind of change the product portfolio. And then in terms of the medical side of things, I'm sure you can talk with people that are much better versed than I am on this. But I think that they have a lot of challenges in terms of the regulatory environment and other types of issues.
I think more than that, the trust issue is also going to come, because at this point we see that genetically modified organisms, there's a lot of fear in the human population, and a lot of people are not comfortable eating genetically modified food. So when they come to know that these are all synthetic biology, these are all coming from synthesis, created human-made organisms, there is going to be some resistance that we will have to overcome. It's a process that we will just have to go through, and there are a lot of different variables, and we will have to identify each of those variable and educate and create awareness. That's the whole reason of this risk roundup, that we are trying to create education and awareness so that people understand what this science is about, and where we are going, and how it is going to impact each and every one of us, each and every entity across nations. Now coming back to just last few points, that your organization, Synthetic Biology Institute, as well as the Joint BioEnergy Institute, what is their focus broadly? I don't want to know any confidential research that is going on, any proprietary, but broadly, what is their focus and where they are going?
Yeah, I can tell you about maybe specifically the types of entities that I'm involved with. And then if you have maybe some broader points of conversation, we can talk about those too. I kind of in the introduction, you kind of mentioned a couple of the institutions that I'm working together with. And one of them is the Joint BioEnergy Institute, and that's a United States Department of Energy. It's within their Office of Science. And JBA's mission is very much a basic science, basic technology development. And we're really trying to develop the science and technologies for enabling us to go from plants all the way to replacement fuels for things like gasoline and diesel and jet fuel. So we have folks that are working kind of in the plant science, maybe chemical engineers, enzymologists that are working on how to convert those plants into fermentable sugars, synthetic biology types of folks, microbiologists, molecular biologists that are engineering the microbes to eat the sugars and produce the fuels. And then we have a lot of technologists, so people that are working on mass spectrometry methodologies or microfluidics or proteomics, metabolomics, people that are working on software types of tools. But it's overall, it's a very basic science and technology type of a mission. And we basically publish everything that we do. We don't keep any trade secrets. We try to basically get all of our technologies out. So it's great for us if we can license our technologies and out into industry so that they can benefit from all of these things. So that's one of the organizations that I'm involved with. Other organizations not too far away from the Joint BioEnergy Institute is the Joint Genome Institute. So it's another Department of Energy, Office of Science supported entity, and they've probably been best known for their DNA sequencing. So they were heavily involved in the Human Genome Project. That's basically how they got their start. But increasingly, they're kind of expanding their breadth into other types of questions. So they too are now kind of working in the synthetic biology space. So in addition to just sequencing organisms for their user community, they're also starting to synthesize constructs to support their users' science. So the Joint Genome Institute is a user facility, and they really basically do science and technology to support the science of all their users. So it's nothing better for the Joint Genome Institute to basically have their users do fantastic science and get Nature and Science publications. So that's basically what they really like. But they have a very broad kind of focus of interest. Another type of entity that's just getting started up now is the Agile Biofoundry, and that's supported by the Department of Energy. It's in its Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Office, so it's a little bit more of an applied office. And the Agile Biofoundry is very much an industry-facing type of an entity. And what we're really trying to do is figure out how we can contribute to valorizing all of this United States biomass. So we have all this billion tons of biomass. How can we make it valuable? And one of the things just to kind of realize is that if you want to develop a biological process to make a product, say we want to start with a plant and you want to make an interesting chemical, whatever it is, or a material, a fuel, the timelines for actually developing that process are very long. So they can take 5 to 10 years, and they might cost $25 or $50 million. So there's a big barrier if you want to actually develop a biological process. It's very lengthy. And it costs a lot. And part of the reason for that is that for the most part, companies, they spend a lot of money on all their technology and all of their know-how and how to make things. And they don't necessarily, it's not to their advantage to share all that information with other companies. So our kind of vision for the Agile Biofoundry is really kind of analogous to what maybe municipalities or cities would be doing with public infrastructure, with maybe, for example, public transportation. So one kind of way of thinking about it is that maybe you can imagine all of chemical space, like all the materials that we might be able to make, is almost kind of like a city map, where every different molecule that you might be making might be like a different residential address. And maybe as you're going to one particular molecule of interest, maybe there's those little city centers, these little hubs. So as a government entity, can we kind of build this public transportation where we can get you, from something like a plant feedstock to these really important kind of hubs around this chemical space. So we're basically building kind of like the train systems, the bus systems, that can kind of get you to these very important places. And then it's up to industry, who has all the business intelligence and marketing, intelligence, to figure out, okay, now we know where we want to go to. We know what molecule we want to make. Can we basically benefit from all this government infrastructure to make our jobs a lot easier, because we don't have to figure it out from scratch? We can now benefit from basically these predefined and pre-developed optimized routes to these key hubs. So we're really trying to figure out how we can reduce the development timelines, reduce the development costs, make sure we can disseminate broadly all this information across companies so that a new startup company doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. They don't have to recapitulate everything that every other company has done. They can basically start with all of this kind of government infrastructure and then take it from there. So that's what we're kind of thinking about in that particular entity.
No, that is very useful. What you just suggested, that is very useful, so that not everyone has to start from scratch, and they already have this foundation that is created by organizations like yours. Now, what are some financial, non-financial, or technical, non-technical challenges that uh, all these groups that you are working with or institutes that you are working with, they are facing currently?
Yeah, so maybe if we can start with financial, types of approaches. So something just to kind of be aware of, and I'm sure this is true of every country, not just the U.S. But in the U.S., we're having a really big administration change, and there's still lots of uncertainties around where the administration is going to have its priorities and where it's going to have other priorities. So I think as of right now, the big question for us is just these uncertainties around what's going to be prioritized and what isn't going to be prioritized. So it's mostly kind of the uncertainties, the risk around that, which is problematic for us. A lot of these efforts, like the Joint BioEnergy Institute or this new effort like the Agile Biofoundry, we actually are extremely fortunate with the resources that we have, and not just kind of like the new resources that we're getting, but the Department of Energy over the last decades has been investing a lot in our infrastructure. So we have fantastic robots, we have fantastic analytical capabilities, we have fantastic scientists. So we're extremely, extremely fortunate. So most of our financial types of questions are kind of around, budgeting certainties. And no one's going to turn down additional resources. So everyone's going to say that, oh, if they only had more resources, they could do more, and that's always true. But I think it's mostly the uncertainty right now, which is kind of challenging. In terms of some of the more technical types of challenges, I think there's a lot of technical challenges right now around how to actually operate the bioeconomy in a very distributed fashion. So it's a lot easier when all of your people, all of your information systems, all of your samples, all of your instruments are all in one particular building. But how do you start developing kind of logistics systems and information systems that can support all of these efforts across different states or different countries? How do you kind of operate in a very distributed type of a fashion? And these are not new problems. I mean, international companies have been operating in a distributed fashion for a long time. But maybe in terms of doing some of the manufacturing, it's maybe a little bit different than has been the case in the past. There's lots and lots of other types of technical challenges. Maybe just to mention a couple. So our ability to actually test biological systems to see if they're actually performing as we'd want them to. Oftentimes we can have tests which are kind of very shallow but very fast, or we can have very in-depth types of analyses, but they take a really long time. So I think one technical challenge is going to be for us, especially as we're still in this trial and error type of a mode, how can we actually get the depth of really nice analytics and make it go a lot faster? So kind of testing types of challenges, how do you increase the throughput? A really, really big technical challenge is how do we actually make biology predictable? So in electronics, we have very good simulation types of tools. You can almost just on a computer, in a computer-aided design program, design a new integrated circuit, and you can be extremely confident that if you actually fabricated that chip, it would actually work as you intended. Sometimes there's probably still going to be failures, but almost all the time it's going to work. In biology, we're just not at that point. So I think a lot of the predictive tools, the modeling tools, all of the repositories for all of the past information that you've gathered, a lot of the information that we've accumulated are just in a person's head or maybe in a paper lab notebook. How do you kind of standardize all of that information in such a way that's accessible to machines to learn from? So right now, social media companies like LinkedIn or Facebook, they have tons and tons of data. It's well structured. They can do all kinds of interesting learnings on it. And I think we're trying to start to do that same thing in biology, where if we had all this data and it's in a nice structured systematic way, we might be able to do very similar types of learnings and make everything that we do more predictable. So there's those types of challenges. I think there's lots of challenges. You mentioned earlier kind of about the context dependence of biology. You can take one gene and it might operate one way in one organism, but not entirely in a different organism. I think there's some other types of technical challenges around process context. So a lot of times biologists focus only on the fermentation bioreactor. So they only focus on their microbe, and they don't pay attention to the upstream feedstock. They don't pay attention to the downstream separation and purification processes. So how do you really design all of these processes in a holistic type of a manner, because the upstream feedstock is going to impact your microbe, and your microbe is going to impact the downstream product. So one just very basic example of that is, let's say that you're using your microbe to produce a monomer that you're going to polymerize into a carpet, so some type of a polymer. So DuPont has a product, Sorona, which is basically a biologically produced polymer. And one of the things that they observed was that when they were producing this monomer, the microbe made a very, very, very small colored contaminant product as well. And it might only be like a part per million. But the problem was they wanted this completely, clear or white type of a fabric, or of like a polymer. But that one little part per million, like say, for example, yellow contaminant, basically made the whole thing yellow, and now they can't sell their product anymore. So little minor changes in maybe the microbe can really dramatically impact kind of the downstream product. And thinking about all that thing as a whole is also a technical challenge, because how do you kind of get all of these different expertise to kind of communicate with each other, and how do you kind of automate the design of all these things together? But there's all kinds of like technical challenges that kind of go along with that. And you also kind of mentioned some of the regulatory types of challenges. And to a certain extent, I think there is a lot of regulation that's already on the books, and it's already very applicable. But there are going to be some situations where it's not necessarily as clear as it could be, or maybe there are some new emerging capabilities and technologies that maybe the regulations, while they could potentially cover in a slightly better way. So I think there's some regulatory types of things, and there's also some cultural challenges. So we kind of talked about in the beginning that it's really important for scientists and engineers to be thinking about the broader aspects and implications of what they're doing. So you don't basically want to have somebody doing something which potentially could have a lot of bad outcomes. You might know at the outset that those things are possible, and maybe the benefits outweigh some of those bad outcomes. But you want to have people thinking broadly about these things, so that you don't bring into the world something that should never have been brought in. So I think it's also a cultural type of a change, and a cultural challenge, to make sure that people are thinking broadly and not just being tunnel visioned around their scientific publication, or be able to improve a process when maybe you have to think about these other types of things.
Yes, absolutely. No, time is now to start thinking about all these different factors, and that is the whole reason we started this Roundup series, so that we can start addressing each and every different topic that is coming our way, that different new innovations, new ideas, new investments, new industries, and their convergence, how it's going to impact the current industries, our nation's economy, the overall global economy. All those factors we need to evaluate, and this is, as far as synthetic biology and bioeconomy goes, this is the first session. So we had to very quickly go through several different topics, and so that our global viewers and listeners get familiar with that. But in the coming months and years, we are going to address each and every topic in much greater depth, and we will provide the understanding that all our viewers and listeners are looking for. So Nathan, thank you so much for participating in Risk Roundup today. We appreciate your thoughtful insight on synthetic biology, bioeconomy, and biofuels. Especially our global viewers and listeners would benefit tremendously from the information you provided on the advances in synthetic biology and the emerging bioeconomy across nations. And even if a single individual or entity can come up with an idea to innovate using synthetic biology and bring the much needed transformation to move from industrial economy to bioeconomy based on the discussion we had today, this Risk Roundup dialogue has been of service, and we thank you for that.
Well, thank you very much, Jayshree. I'm very happy that I was able to participate and talk with you today.
Wonderful, Nathan. So no scientific achievement has promised so much or has come up with clear possibilities and potential for global transformation, and none has brought opportunity for deliberate abuse and misuse or existential risk to the human species as synthetic biology. Although we speak about the biological future that can be engineered the way we want, it is important to understand and evaluate whether we have enough knowledge to prevent the existential risk. Risk Group Cybersecurity Risk Research Center and Strategic Security Risk Research Center are created for this very reason, to identify evaluate and manage the risk facing NGIOA in CGS, that means nations, its government, industries, organizations, and academia, in cyberspace, geospace, and space, and discuss, debate, and define necessary framework, structure, processes, tools, and technologies to manage the security risk of not only the digital global age, but also of the coming technological superconvergence, and the areas like bioeconomy and synthetic biology. We at Risk Group believe that risk management, security, and peace, they walk together hand in hand. Though security is related to management of threats, and peace to the management of conflict, risk management is related to the management of security vulnerabilities as well as management of conflict. It is not possible to conceive any one of the three without the existence of the other two. All three concepts feed into each other. We believe that the security we build for ourselves is precarious and uncertain until it is secure for everyone across nations. Tradition becomes our security. So if we build a culture of managing risk effectively, it will lead us to security, and security will lead us to peace. Let's manage the existing and emerging risks together. For more information on the risk roundups, to watch the risk roundup videos or hear the risk roundup podcast, please go to riskgroupllc.com and do not forget to subscribe and share. Until next time, I'm Jayashree Pandya, host of Risk Roundup, signing off. See you next time. Thank you.